Hello and welcome to this video on why your bonsai pots are a consumable item. If you think about consumables in bonsai, your obvious thought will be the wire used to style the tree. You might think of raffia, a potting mix or soil. In some cases you might also see tools as a consumable, but what about the pots? Pots do wear down and break over time. Sometimes this is from a sudden demonstration of gravity in action and what happens when ceramic stops suddenly on a hard surface. Other times they just seem to crack and break no matter how much you care for them, and certainly no matter how much you buy a premium pot. The nice imported ones can be very stunning in how they look and they have the best reputation, but they suffer just as much from the same issues we'll describe in this video. But either way, they're not able to be used for exhibitions once they begin to break down. We do know why the bonsai pots seem to spontaneously break, but we can't necessarily explain what causes a spontaneous demonstration of gravity. Bonsai pots are typically made from a thin and lightweight ceramic, and not China degrees of lightweight and thin, but also not terracotta thick and strong, let alone concrete. This is a simple balancing act between the ability to hold the bonsai tree and soil, while not being so big, heavy and limited in internal volume, so as to be unusable. For the most part, you can use many types of clay to make your bonsai pot, everything from air-dry modeling clay to the most specialized and niche of clay options. No matter which, they are molded, air-dried, fired, painted, lacquered, and sealed. The pot is then ready for use. The process is ultimately not so different from any other clay object of a similar nature. What separates the bonsai pot, at least away from others, is twofold. One is that it is very thin-walled. The other is that this pot is used externally. Typically speaking, pots of this thickness would be inside type things. Think of something like a vase. It is the juncture of the combination of how it is used and where it is used that makes these vulnerable to breakage. First we have the thin pot wall. Bonsai pots have a very thin wall, or at least relative to the standard sort of ceramic pot. This is important as the inside volume that can be used for soil is small, so taking up any of that space of the pot wall would be bad. The way the bonsai pots make up for this is with the thicker rim at the top and bottom that act like a reinforcement, similar to how large barrels have metal rims on the top and bottom that keep the barrels strong. The pot is protected externally with lacquer, in some instances anyway, or paint if it's not a lacquer or if it's not a bare pot. Only the outside is covered, and this stops water from leaching in, or more accurately from the outside in or the inside out. The reason the pots are not glazed on the inside typically is a combination of extra work, the extra cost, the lack of benefit, and that the roots use it as a sort of rough surface they can hold on to. And by not adding glaze, you can keep the pot cheaper, you can make it quicker, you don't need to stop water from leaching as much, and obviously the roots can get a better grip. This is a design feature, not a design bug. And now we have what happens with your thin-walled piece of clay when it is kept outside. Unfortunately, this is a major reason why it breaks. First, we have day-to-day temperature changes. This causes the pot to shrink and grow slightly. As it is clay, the shrinkage and growth is small, but there, at least from one day to the next. You probably won't even be able to measure it without high-accuracy tools. Importantly, you can actually see the change in this over time, assuming that you start with a almost perfectly flat and perfectly set lacquer on the outside of the pot. This should look like a solid, completely unblemished surface. However, if you experience more extreme changes, for example between summer and winter, you can see the phenomena that we'll describe. In summer, the temperature causes the pot to grow. The painted outside surface will not grow as much as the inside or the ceramic that makes up the pot. And in winter, conversely, the outside won't shrink, but the inside ceramics will. This is much easier to see and tell with that outside treatment, because you can actually observe those cracks forming. If it's not covered with any kind of lacquer or similar, you would still need a caliper or similar, but the differences will be more obvious. The effect of the expansion and contraction of clay over 1 year isn't much. However, it adds up over time, and this is one reason why, no matter what, your pots will eventually break. After a few years, the pot will develop what are called microcracks from the expansion and contraction. When the pot expands, the mass is the same, but it needs to take up slightly more space. This puts distance between the molecules. The energy introduced remains there, and as it dissipates, the pot will shrink again. As the pot gets cold, or very cold as it is in winter, it will lose that energy, and the molecules get pulled closer together. This causes it to shrink. Over time, the changes in size cause gaps between the molecules to remain larger. This causes small cracks. These are the microcracks, and the challenge is that these microcracks grow. This is why if you look at a pot that is brand new from the factory, and one that's been around for many years, you'll see that there are larger fissures between that lack of finish, while in other areas they're just small spiderweb or cobweb type cracks. These are showing you what's happening inside the ceramic, just on the outside in a slightly more obvious manner. And more so since the cracks create gaps between areas of expansion and contraction. This is why it looks like a spider web. These areas become small islands. That is the area between each of the threads in that spiderweb formation. These islands become separated and isolated. This separation makes the cracks bigger over time, because they're able to separate each of those little islands of solid mass. Eventually they become too much, and they become a fault or a weakness. But when that weakness reaches a critical point, the pot will eventually break. The break can happen over time through this process continuing, that contraction and expansion due to hot and cold cycles. Or it can occur when it experiences unexpected force, such as when the pot is picked up. That sudden change, for example, the weight of the contents of the bonsai, the soil, and the fact that you're lifting it, can suddenly apply pressure that causes a fault to be unable to cope with that extra stress and suddenly snap. This is why bonsai pots break. It's the combination of those thin ceramic walls, the nature of ceramic materials, and the cracking and seasonal exposure of the bonsai pots. You could arguably resolve this by keeping them inside all year round, but that's not going to work for most bonsai species. And that's why, no matter how you look at this, your bonsai pot is a consumable item, and why no matter what you do, for the most part, it will inevitably and eventually break. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.